Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on this midday discussion with Perry Bulwer about his book and life in a Doomsday cult. I guess God was angry at us and didn't want you to be able to see him. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation, and our work spans many different territories across the province. My name's Ian Bushfield, and I'm the Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association. Tonight's event is with Perry Bulwer. Perry joined the Children of God after dropping out of high school at age 16, spending 2 decades living in those communities across the world. In 1991, at age 36, he was able to escape the cult, and he now advocates for second-generation cult survivors, continuing to shed light on the Children of God, also known as the family. He has a law degree from UBC, and he joins us from Port Alberni, where he was also born. For those of you not familiar with humanism, we're a worldview that promotes free inquiry, science, and compassion. As a small charity, we rely on your donations to make our work and these events possible. If you're not a member yet, go to our website, bchumanist.ca/join, to sign up and make a one-time monthly donation at bchumanist.ca/donate. We've had a ton of busy work these past couple weeks and months announcing lawsuits against the cities of Parksville and Vancouver, and just releasing earlier this week a report on municipal prayers in Alberta. We are working furiously at a number of other reports and activities. So a lot is happening, and I'm hopeful we can get more in-person events going soon. So definitely make sure to stay connected with our work. With that, I'll turn it over to our guest and author, Perry Bulwer.
I mean, it's kind of comical. You mentioned maybe God's angry at us for doing this. I should have sure, because the cult I was in was so secretive. This is not me, this technical glitch is real. This isn't me trying to hide my identity, as a sort of a cult hangover. I guess maybe I should just give a real brief sort of overview of what this cult was, and then I can kind of give a timeline of my story through that. And again, this secrecy thing, it was a super secret cult in terms of what its members told the outside world, in terms of what even members knew about the group and other members. We all had pseudonyms and Bible names, etc. And this cult evolved over its 50-year history or so, constantly changing. So it's one difficulty in telling my story is to give a sense of what this cult was, even while it changed constantly, its names and practices and policies and all through the years. So basically, it was formed in 1968 in California by a failed preacher called David Berg. He was from a long line of famous evangelists in the States. His mother was one of the very first female radio evangelists in the U.S. She had a radio show in the 20s or 30s, I believe. He followed after her footsteps. She kind of worked outside of mainstream churches, did her own evangelizing and so-called faith healing, which turned out to be a totally fake story of her own healing, which is kind of common in that world of faith healers and evangelists. Anyway, her son David, he tried his bid at being a pastor briefly of a Christian and Missionary Alliance church, which is, for some of you, you may know, the church that our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, joined because his wife was a member. So I always thought that was an interesting connection, because that church, Christian and Missionary Alliance, although a fairly mainstream church, has its own history of abuses. And so David Berg breaks away from that, and with his 4 young children starts a ministry. They were teens by this time, preaching to the hippies on the beaches of California, Huntington Beach specifically. And what they were part of then was part of the wider Jesus People movement. So that had already been going on for a few years in the 60s, part of the charismatic movement that was sweeping through mainstream churches, both Protestant and Catholic churches. this charismatic movement based on the gifts of the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts, and the Jesus people movement in general, not a specific group, but just the movement in general came out of that new approach to sort of living the Bible and practicing literally what it taught. And a lot of different Jesus people groups emerged from that. They'd set up coffee shops and drop-in centers, and they were reaching the youth. But a lot of these groups are still connected with churches in some way. What made David Berg stand out was he called for what he referred to as a revolution for Jesus, totally breaking away from all churches, creating his own little group, and claiming that, his band of followers were the true Christians, the only true Christians really living the Bible according to the first disciples in the book of Acts. And they grew pretty rapidly between 68 and the time I joined them in 1972. There was about 2,000 members. When I joined, and I'm going to make a comment about that word join, but when I joined them in 1972, I was 16 years old, dropped out of high school. I didn't know any of that history. I didn't even know they had a leader called David Berg. They have a very specific indoctrination process. And so just to go back to that word join, nobody joins a cult. I mean, that's just like they join some self-help group or some, religious group, but they don't go in thinking, oh, here's a nice cult I want to join. That kind of sneaks up on them, and a very common tactic across all cults, whether they're religious or political or health cult, whatever, self-improvement cults. They start off by sort of manipulating and deceiving people without revealing their true purpose, which you only find out once you're hooked. And so in my case, in the Children of God, so the name Children of God actually was given to this group when David Berg and his growing followers started actually invading churches, going into church services and disrupting it and holding protests and traveling all around the U.S. in caravans of trailers and buses, etc. Some reporter described David Berg as Moses and his followers the children of God, and that name kind of stuck. And so Moses became David Berg's alias. I never learned his real name till years later. Oh no, sorry, no, that's a different. I'll go back to the indoctrination. So I meet these people in Port Alberni. They got a small commune. They invite me to go visit them. And I should add, I was raised a Catholic. I was indoctrinated in the Catholic Church. I became an altar boy. So my Christian and Catholic indoctrination, I was a true believer. And I had no other worldview, no other. I just accepted what I was taught. And so, although I'd stopped going to church around the age of 13, 14, I still believed in God. And then along come these sort of hippie Christians preaching this new way of believing in the Bible. And I got really enamored. Part of it was I wanted to find an escape out of Port Alberni. I didn't see a future working in mills and that kind of stuff. And most of you will know the 60s, that era of political unrest and social upheaval and the short-lived hippie movement, all the protests, etc. All of that environment that I grew up in sort of fed into my anxieties and worries about the future and what I'm going to do with my life. These people come along and kind of give me all the answers, right? It was a very quick process from the time I met them. I started going to their place all the time for Bible studies. And within just 2 months, maybe not even that, I decided I'm going to just drop out of society and go live with them. And literally drop out of society because they did not work. They don't have jobs. They didn't go to school. I quit school, dropped out of grade 11. They were trying to live communally like the first Christians did. and live off the donations of outsiders and just completely create their own society. And so, as I said, when I first moved in with them, I didn't know anything about their history, that they had a leader, that there was 2,000 members across the states, and they were starting to go into Europe. And so they slowly introduced this to me. The leader, David Berg, what he did was he soon separated from his followers because it was the police and other authorities were interested in what he was up to, because a lot of parents were freaking out that this group was brainwashing their kids. So he was on the run from the law, basically. So what he did was he communicated with his followers by writing letters. And these became eventually, over time, the equivalent of the Bible. His word became the Bible. But at first, when I moved in the first night, they read one of his letters, a short letter. They just told me, well, it was by some, pastor, elder who gave them advice. They didn't tell me he was the leader. So they wait until 3 months. So the first 3 months, I'm in Port Alberni. I'm doing their activities. We're going out on the streets, what we call witnessing, evangelizing, trying to gain supporters and save souls. And I was just being taught basic Bible dogma from their point of view, very fundamentalist, a literal translation of the Bible. They believe the Bible's literally true. And so I started memorizing Bible verses and getting basic courses. And once they've got you for 3 months, that was sort of at that point, they decided, okay, you're sold out enough. I was in far enough that they're now going to tell me their more esoteric teachings. They're what they really truly believed. And it was in the next 3 months. So I moved from Port Alberni to Nanaimo, where they had what was called it was a boot camp, basically, for new recruits like me. And so in that second 3 months, after 3 months, they started to teach me what they really believed, which was that David Berg was an end-time prophet, that he's actually named in the Bible in books like the book of Ezekiel, Daniel, other Old Testament books. There's verses about that refer to a King David in the latter days. David Berg had this entire origin myth around how he was ordained by God even while he was still in his mother's belly, just like John the Baptist. He kind of usurps that story of John the Baptist and Jesus. So now David Berg is this end-time prophet who is given very specific prophecies that predict a timeline for the end time. So in my book, I lay that all out. I set out that timeline that David Berg himself preached and for years told us was going to happen, and that's the way it was. And basically, what it was the last 7 years of world history. It would be starting with the rise of an Antichrist, this Antichrist character who would come on the scene politically and basically take over the world. There'd be this massive war. 3.5 years later, he sets up a temple and takes over the Holy Temple in Israel, the Holy Mount, which is this huge political issue in Israel, the Temple Mount, where the Jews and the Muslims both claim it as their holy territory. Antichrist is going to set up there. Anyway, at the end of this 7 years, Jesus returns. So Berg specifically predicted that Jesus was coming back in 1993. And so when you work backwards 7 years from that would be when the mid-80s, the Antichrist would appear. So it's very specific. And by that time, it took just months of being in that environment, totally isolated, only being fed what their teachings, that I became a believer. I believed David Berg was that end-time prophet. I believed his predictions. And it was that belief that kept me in this group for so long. Now, the rest of my life and story in that cult, it's quite wild ride. and there's so many details. I can easily get bogged down and take up too much time here. So I'll just kind of quickly run through it. After Nanaimo, I moved to a commune in Victoria, then to Vancouver. In Vancouver, we were on the streets constantly. We were competing with the Hare Krishna. We went to one of the very last, what they call be-ins or sit-ins at Stanley Park, Lumberman's Arch. Big gathering, like based on the hippie, sit-ins in California. So those continued in Vancouver until the early 70s. So we were at that. Berg comes out with this prediction that this comet Kohoutek, that the scientists said was going to make this major, massive appearance in our skies. Berg latched onto that news and said it was a sign. Comets are signs from God, and that this was a sign that his prophecies were true. He's warning all his followers to get out of North America because there's a war coming. I should add that Berg was very, very anti-American. He hated America, and throughout much of his writings, it was all about how America was going to be destroyed for turning its back on God. And he urged all his followers to get out of North America and go into all the world, preach the gospel so that Jesus could come back. So that's what we did. I fled from Vancouver, went to Seattle, and then on to Hawaii. I ended up in Japan for a year, so I was among the very first members of this group to show up in Japan, and we started forming communes there, and I traveled all over Japan, evangelizing all over. From there, and I got into trouble with the law a few times, which I'll come back to later, where I got, towards the end of my stay there, I got picked up by immigration authorities and threatened with deportation because I was selling our literature on the street while on a tourist visa, and so that's illegal. They didn't deport me, but I moved on from there to the Philippines. Same story, among the very first members there. We set up communes around the country. This was during the time of the Marcos dictatorship. So we're talking, 70, the Philippines, 76, 77, a couple of years. A year after I arrived in the Philippines, there was some changes in the cult's leadership, and it was getting harsher, and I was getting into trouble with leaders, getting punished over minor things, and though I still believed in Berg, I was getting disillusioned with the leadership structure. So I walked away from the commune one day, and I spent the next year alone outside of the group, hiding in basically jungle villages in a remote island of Mindanao. Basically, I didn't want to go back to Canada or North America because it was going to be destroyed. So I was just kind of waiting for the world to fall apart. And this is, an aspect of all doomsday cults and apocalyptic thinkers. They actually want the world to be destroyed. They want World War III because then it proves your beliefs are true. And that's kind of where I was at. I was just hoping that the Third World War would start and I would be able to stay in the Philippines regardless of my visa situation. Of course, that never happened. My time was running out. I contacted my parents who got me a plane ticket back to Canada. So now I'm back in Port Alberni. This is basically about the second half of 1977. And again, although I wasn't in the cult, like literally or technically with living in one of their communes, I was still a true believer. I still believed everything Berg taught. And so here in Port Alberni again in the late 70s, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just spinning my wheels, getting odd jobs. I'm waiting for all these end time events to happen. So in 1979, things are falling apart in my own life. I encountered two Children of God members who were on a road trip passing through Port Alberni. They had my parents' address and my name in a little notebook because years earlier, my parents had put up cult members, let them pitch a tent in their backyard, for example. So they were considered friendly contacts. I bump into these two people by chance. Make a long story short, that led me back into the cult. there had been lots of new developments within the group, reorganizations. David Berg, the leader, wrote a letter. There were a lot of people like me who had left, disillusioned by the leadership structure and certain policies, but who were still believers. So they had this campaign to bring us back into the fold. Very specific letter addressed to us saying, things have changed. Please come back. And again, like I'd never deconstructed or processed my previous time in the cult. So I was just right back in it, like nothing had changed. December 79, I took the train across Canada to Halifax, where there was a commune where one of the members I'd bumped into a few months earlier, she was now there. So I went there. And from there, the next year, I lived in a converted school bus. I hooked up with a woman and her two older children. We became a little couple within the group. We lived for a year on the bus, traveling all over Western Canada. Bus broke down. I come back to Port Alberni. So we're now in Port Alberni again. Now I'm with a wife and two stepkids. So let's say 81, 82. And our plan then was to raise money to go east, to go overseas to a mission field. Again, Berg, throughout this whole time, Berg keeps pumping out letters about the end is near, America's going to be destroyed. So that whole push is still going on. So that led us back to Asia. So by 83 now, 83, 84, we first started off in Malaysia. From there, leadership saw me and my now wife because one of my stepkids refused to join us. She was old enough to stay behind in Canada, so we had only one older child. In the group, families, there was no birth control allowed, so most couples had tons of kids. Me and my wife were very rare, and so in having just one older child, leadership saw that as something they could exploit. So from then on, we got pulled into sort of leadership homes and special units doing translations. We were support workers for translation units and office units. From Malaysia, went to Macau, which still was a colony of Portugal at the time. Now it's returned to China. From there to Hong Kong. All the communes and all cult members in Hong Kong had to suddenly leave when the government started pressuring us and persecuting us, what we considered persecution. I ended up back in Japan. So for most of the late 80s into 1990 and 91, 91 was the year I finally escaped. But I was in and out of Japan. I spent 2, 3, 4 years in Japan. Oh, I should add for 1 year, from 85 to 86, I spent a year in Beijing teaching English. So I was in communist China. In my book, I actually refer to that time as, although I was in this very restrictive communist country, we had to really be secretive. I felt I had more freedom there than when I was back in a normal commune situations, back in Japan or Hong Kong or wherever I was, because the cult was just as restrictive and controlling as any communist regime. So in the last part of 1980s into 1991, I'm in and out. I'm in this massive, giant commune compound in Japan that had a music studio and video studio for producing music cassettes and video cassettes that we sold for funds, back and forth from Japan to the Philippines to Hong Kong, back to Japan again, a lot of traveling. So over this whole time I've just discussed, when I first joined, there was some members had a few children, but they were very young. So now by 1990, for example, there was a lot of children and teens. The cult was having a very difficult time controlling, especially the adolescents, the teens. What they decided to do was take a really harsh stand. They believed in corporal punishment. So teens who were not towing the line, who were disobedient or disrespectful or whatever their issue was, no matter how minor, they started collecting these so-called delinquent teens into specialized communes and compounds that were basically prison camps for teenagers, that very similar to what's in the secular world, these different programs for delinquent teens, wilderness programs, or there's a terminology there. It's not coming to me right away, but basically they were trying to beat these teens into submission. So there was a lot of abuse. And of course, it wasn't all outward and open. In a commune in Macau, I began to hear whispers of things that were from other teens that worked with me. For example, when I'd be on different jobs, they tell me things. Something wasn't right. There was a lot of abuse going on that I didn't recognize as abuse, as I was this indoctrinated cult member, seeing everything that was going on through that perspective. I really didn't recognize a lot of abuse for what it was. Even something as simple as corporal punishment, spankings, they took it to an extreme, using basically weapons, wooden boards, or with air holes cut in to reduce, to make it hit harder. It was quite extreme. I just believed that was all okay. But I then I started hearing things I heard about a teen suicide. He was 13. I lived in a commune with him. It was all hushed up. I found out about it, and I couldn't make sense of that. Like, we were supposed to be the best Christians in the world, with the best system and the best way of training children. Why would a 13-year-old take his own life? Things weren't adding up. There was a lot of stuff I witnessed personally that just was the end for me. I decided, in particular, the daughter of the granddaughter of David Berg, there was a series of letters written about her because she was one of these so-called rebellious teens, where she was subjected to horrific exorcisms, extreme abuse. These were all written up in letters as a warning for other teens and even the adults. I was distant from that just by reading it. Anything that troubled me or caused doubts, I would just stick in the back of my mind and not deal with it, because I didn't know how to deal with it. But I was then sent to a special compound in Macau, which was one of the first and worst of these teen detention centers. And here she was. She had been sent from David Berg's home after all those exorcisms to her uncle's compound in Macau, and I ended up there. And I saw her one day, and she had a sign around her neck that said, "Don't talk to me. I'm on silent restriction." Like, she was forbidden from talking to other people. It was one of her punishments. So I started seeing a lot of these things going on that were just caused such chaos in my mind. I couldn't reconcile all of that. I couldn't figure it out. I just knew it was wrong. So now from there, I'm back in Japan. I'm in that big compound. And one day, any kind of outside information was forbidden to us. News, music, movie. Like, we could only watch approved movies, for example, and we had all our own music. But I had managed to get a Walkman, a Sony Walkman, because we all had Walkmans to listen to our cassette tapes. But I got one while I was in Hong Kong that had a radio on it. And so I started secretly listening to an American Forces radio station in Japan. And one day, in the midst of all this turmoil in my mind and trying to deal with all of this, what was going on, the REM song came on, "Losing My Religion." Now, the song I've learned since is not really about someone losing their religion. That's how I heard it. And it was like a light bulb going, yeah, that's what's going on. All these doubts were considered sin in the cult, but all my doubts were surfacing, all this inner turmoil. And it was from there I made this, I've got to leave. I got to escape. I got to get out of this place. And of course, I'm overseas with no money, no connections. I've got, how do you escape something like that when you have no support, no money? I had to concoct this elaborate plan, which I did deceive the leaders with, and I eventually got back to Canada. Now, there's more to that story. It kind of reads like a movie, actually, when you read it. because it's not just as simple as me leaving Japan and back in Canada. I come back to Canada, I go back to Japan, I come back to Canada again, all within 3 weeks. But basically, September 1991 was my liberation day. That's the day I finally escaped the cult for good. And this time I wasn't making the same mistake I did the first time. And this part of the story might perhaps of most interest to many of your members as it applies to humanism. But I mean, I was still a believer in God. I'd rejected the cult leaders' dogma, but I still believed in God, but I didn't know how to deal with that as I tried to survive and create a new life for myself. So I put my religious beliefs on hold. I just decided I'm not going to reject them or accept. I'm just going to put them in the back of my mind while I get on with surviving. So a year later, I started university in 1992 at what's now called Vancouver Island University. In that first semester before classes started, I happened upon a book in the library called God is Red. And it's by a very famous American Indian activist, lawyer, wrote many, many books. And what he did in that book, God is Red, is sort of critique Christianity from an indigenous point of view. It was the first time I'd ever encountered any sort of opposition to the Bible or any critique of the Bible at all. I mean, I had no people in my life who ever questioned or doubted. It was just, so that was an eye-opener. And through the next 4 years, I was in a program called Liberal Studies, perfect education for someone like me. It was part of my sort of cult recovery. It was my own self-directed cult recovery, deconstructing my beliefs. And so throughout those 4 years, I'd write essays. I would pull on my beliefs to sort of dissect them and then reject them. And perhaps the biggest thing of all, the biggest aha moment for me. Now, remember, the cult was very fundamentalist, biblical literalists. So creation was 7-day event, like 6,000 years ago. And that was always a hard thing for me to wrap my head around, so I never dealt with it. I just shoved it in the back of my head. David Berg taught that Charles Darwin his theory of evolution was the big lie, right? And so at university, I actually read on the origin of species, and that blew my mind and that's the aha moment I had when Darwin explains exactly and sets out exactly how evolution can occur. And so I finished my studies, but afterwards, a few years later, I started reading other books, and I eventually got to the point where I completely rejected all my religious beliefs. Yeah, I went through different stages of how I referred to myself. I've sort of recently settled on agnostic atheist, just for that. I mean, it's kind of borrowing Richard Dawkins' idea, of maybe there's that fairy in the bottom of the garden. You never know. Just hold out that 0.0001% chance. And since then, what I did was become an advocate for, especially for people who were born and raised in that cult, who had no choice, who were not members of their own choice. They are born into it. My book describes a whole range of abuses that they were subjected to. And another thing my book does that's kind of unique among cult survivor stories is I take on academic cult apologists who, in this case, specifically defended this cult, but who have defended other cults. And so there's a couple sections in my book where I go through and sort of critique and I basically criticize them for enabling the abuse to go on for much longer than it really needed to. And so I'm skipping a whole lot of stuff, and that's sort of just kind of a general overview, but it's kind of in a nutshell, that's the story.
Thank you so much for that, Perry. I mean, that's such a fascinating life, and I'm glad to hear you're through it and out of it. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your lunch today.